Hello, Stephen.
Hello.
Do you know, I've been a fan of yours for many years. In fact, I attended a lecture that you gave in London. A few years ago, it was AC Grayling arranged it, and it was aimed at an audience of children. It was aimed at the school children market. I expect you remember. So
I'm actually drawing a blank, but go ahead.
Oh, right. Well, it was some time ago, but I brought my daughter along just to validate my being there, and I took some notes on I don't know, some scrap of paper, the back of an envelope or something, and I've recently prepared a video based on the notes on what you said at that lecture. And if you go to my YouTube channel, which is called Free Thought Channel, you will be able to see my efforts at putting your words into a video. Oh, but it's enough about my nonsense.
I will check it out.
So it's enough about my nonsense. We're here, and thank you very much for helping us out in the absence of AC, who's on his sick bed, I'm afraid. So he was going to speak about proving atheism. What's your view of that? Do you think is it a possibility?
Well, it's I mean, there's a cliche that you can't prove a negative, and it is for one thing, proof is something that we usually reserve for mathematical and logical propositions, not so much for empirical ones. And I take it that the existence of a divinity is an empirical proposition. I mean, it is possible, and it could happen tomorrow, that a robed figure with wings and sandals and wearing a robe could descend from the heavens and announce that all virtuous people will go on an escalator to heaven, and virtuous people will be absorbed in a world of fiery damnation. Or that such a figure could heal the sick, or restore sight to the blind. I don't think it'll happen, but it could happen. So I don't think it's so much a case of proving or disproving atheism, but rather there's got to be a reason. There should be a reason to believe anything that you believe, and that includes a God or souls, spirits, miracles, and that in the particular case, there is no dispute. So that, and each of the putative reasons can be disputed. Such as the existence of miracles, the survival of the soul after the death of the body, the various mysteries that previously were attributed to divine magic, but which now have a naturalistic explanation, such as earthquakes and thunderbolts, but then the origin and evolution of life, and increasingly the activity of the mind, formerly still commonly attributed to an immaterial soul, but a hypothesis that modern neuroscience is rendering obsolete. John, you're muted.
Oh.
Now you're not.
Good. That's what your lecture was about, that I attended. It was about the improbability of the need for dualism.
Yes, that is that that one of the compelling reasons to believe in God is that our own intelligence, our own consciousness is indeed intuitively mysterious. It doesn't act like other natural occurrences in front of us, like dropping a rock and it falls down. And it's natural to think that each one of us has some kind of scoop of divinity that has been wedded to our meat and juices, that allows us to be conscious and to solve problems and to interact with one another. So it is tempting, and I would even say that prior to the discovery of neurons and neural circuitry and the discovery of the concepts of information and computation and control, which explain how material objects can carry out intelligence or rational processes, it wasn't so irrational to believe in God. Just as I think none other than Richard Dawkins said that prior to the theory of evolution, it was perfectly rational to accept the argument from design and to attribute all of the science of design in the living world to a divine engineer. Then Darwin came along and came up with a much better explanation, and that was, for the first time, made it less than rational. Likewise, before we knew how what neurons were, before we knew how you could build logic gates out of neurons and synapses, before we knew that physical devices, we now call them computers, can actually carry out intelligence, it was a natural step to attribute our uncanny ability to be in touch with the world, to think, to reason, to come up with truths that we didn't experience, witness with our own senses, to attribute that to some kind of divine spark in each of us, some spark which might even, since it's not obvious how it comes from the body, it's perfectly reasonable to think that it can exist separately from the body. And then so you have angels and spirits and souls and afterlife. These are perfectly intuitive beliefs. We now have many reasons to believe that they're false beliefs, however intuitive they were, such as the fact that all thought and emotion depend on the physiological activity of the brain. When the physiological activity of the brain ceases, the thoughts and emotions go out of existence. Again, this is an empirical hypothesis. It's conceivable that Aunt Hilda in a seance could tell us where she hid under which floorboard she hid the jewelry, and we could open up the floorboard and there it is. And if we could rule out various kinds of subterfuge or cheating, that would be a rational reason to think that there might be a soul that can survive the death of the body. But in fact, that never happens. All of those demonstrations are fraud or suggestion or kitschy science fiction or mystery fiction. We have reason to believe that doesn't happen, that when the person's brain stops working, there's no more person. And so that is, if not a proof of atheism, it's pulling out one of the main props for theism, namely the human mind.
Yes. Can you unmute me, Steve? Thank you. Yes. Well, although there's no evidence for the dualism in the sense of a mind that's separate from the brain, the brain seems very much to be the host of the mind, there is a discontinuity between what goes on inside here and what's actually out there. I like to think in terms of the conceptual realm, where we can come up with all sorts of ideas like Humpty Dumpty, and then completely separately, there's the outside, the imperial, the natural arena, and there's no necessary or essential connection between the two. What do you say to that?
Well, there's no necessary connection. We are kept in touch with reality, both by our sense organs, where physical signals like air vibrations or electromagnetic radiation or airborne molecules physically interact with our sense organs. They are transduced into neural activity, preserving some of the information, and therefore a brain can be kept in touch with reality. Also, we have lawful systems of belief about the interactions among things in the world, and they tend to work pretty well. That is, if I hold a rock and I imagine releasing it, I predict that the rock will fall, and sure enough, it does fall. So there are systems of inference and belief also mirror to a large extent those of reality, though they don't have to. We can also play out thought experiments in our head. In fact, that's one of the reasons why humans are so smart, namely we aren't fixed to the tangible here and now, but we can play out alternative scenarios in our mind's eye, both for entertainment, but more consequentially for planning. What would happen if I bent a twig and had a noose at the other end and had it triggered by an animal knocking over a trigger? Well, I can visualize that it might strangle the animal, and in fact, it does if it's properly constructed. And so that kind of counterfactual thinking or hypothetical thinking clearly had survival advantages, and we can also spin it off to all kinds of imaginary worlds.
Indeed. Well, Lawrence Krauss was speaking to us a minute ago, and he seemed to think that proof is not available to science because proof has this idea of absoluteness, and whereas we can conceive of it, we haven't actually found it anywhere.
Well, there is.
What we do collect is evidence. And as you say,
this goes back to Hume and his distinction between matters of fact and relations among ideas, that proof is in the realm of formal systems like mathematics and logic. Whereas we can be absolutely certain that if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. Whereas for empirical matters, it's a matter of degree of credence. From 0, it's impossible, to 1, it's certain, but more often various degrees in between that are calibrated by the strength of the evidence and our prior understanding.
Ask Stephen a question. Yes, here we go.
Just as you mentioned, Hume, he was wary of inductive arguments. You lean on deductive arguments rather than inductive. We were all inductive and we're sharing this reality. Yes. Is it something we should be wary of?
Did you get that, Stephen?
Unfortunately, I did not. So I'm going to ask if you could paraphrase or even just repeat the question. Apologies.
Sure.
I could not make it.
It's a question about deductive versus inductive arguments. And I know what A.C. Grayling would say if he was here. He would say that deductive arguments are circular. They just rearrange what you start with. And inductive arguments are the ones that give us most of what we understand from an empirical scientific position.
Well, there is a considerable debate in the philosophy of mathematics and the foundation of mathematics about whether deductive proofs are merely circular. And I think there's a lot of mathematicians who would deny that, perhaps a majority, who are realists, or you might call them Platonists, namely that mathematical truths exist as part of the fabric of reality, and that our proofs allow us to reason about them, but they're not in that sense circular. That is, the Pythagorean theorem really is a truth about two-dimensional planes. It isn't just inventing a bunch of tokens and manipulating them, but it really is about something, and about something that exists apart from us. And there are arguments that Gödel's incompleteness theorem show that there are, because there are truths that are not deducible in any system of axioms and rules of inference, but are true nonetheless, then mathematical truth can't be equated with deducibility from a fixed set of axioms and rules of inference. Now, this is not my area, so if challenged, I don't know if I could give the airtight arguments for them, but it's important to realize that there are alternatives to what might be called the formalist theory of the foundations of mathematics, identified often with David Hilbert, according to which deductive truths are nothing but circularities, that is, manipulation of tokens according to rules of the game.
Platonist or a nominist? Are you a Platonist or a nominist?
I mean, not nominalist?
Yes.
I guess in that sense of whether mathematical truths have some reality above and beyond just the rules of the game that we've invented. I think I am a realist, or you could maybe call it a Platonist. I think that's probably a fancier version of realism. And in this, I've got to say that I'm influenced by the real philosopher in the family, my spouse, Rebecca Goldstein, novelist and philosopher, and another visiting faculty at Anthony Grayling's New College of the Humanities. but she is she wrote a book on Gödel called Incompleteness, and she has briefed me with the arguments from the philosophy of mathematics as to why mathematical truths are not necessarily just the playing with combinations of symbols according to the rules of an arbitrary game. That there may be at least it's coherent, and to say that there is a reality, an abstract reality. It's not stuff. You can't kick it with your foot, but nonetheless, the laws of mathematics are part of the texture of reality that our discipline of mathematics seeks to expose.
The other problem with the title of this evening, Proving Atheism, is the word atheism, because it has an ending that is used mostly for ideologies, isn't it? I mean, the ism ending is used mostly for conservatism, socialism, various sorts of ideology.
Yes.
And the theists want to try and make out that atheism is an ideology. What do you say to that?
Well, indeed, and in fact, I could call on my my familiarity with linguistics to note that atheism can be parsed into morphemes in two ways. It's structurally ambiguous. You could say that it's atheis, that is denial of God, joined with ism, namely the system of belief or ideology centered on the denial of God. I think it's more likely, more natural to parse it as theism, namely a belief in God, and the a prefix is denying that. So it's so if you think of atheism as the rejection of theism, then it itself is not an ism. It is the rejection of that particular ism, and that's the way I prefer to think about it. And indeed, either way you think about it, it's all you're doing is denying some belief that many people have. But once you deny a belief, all you've done is denied a belief. You're not actually committing yourself to anything in particular. Just like I don't believe in Thor and Zeus and in Vishnu, and I don't believe in Yahweh either. I don't believe in any of them. But that lays the ground open for all kinds of belief systems, certainly in the realm of morality, where I've said many times, including in my book Enlightenment Now, that the basis of the non-theistic basis for morality is not atheism itself, which simply denies theism, but rather in humanism, which is a positive moral system.
Well, you've got nods and smiles from over here. We all think the atheism way is the way forward. That's up to you. You need to switch it on. That's it. Is it push up? No, that's red. Push up to green.
Hello, Steve. My name's Steve as well. So good to speak to you.
Nice to speak to you.
I've read The Better Angels of Our Nature twice, and Rationality Now twice, and I've also read your latest book twice. So I'm a bit of a fan of yours. I would like to just ask a couple of questions. Firstly, with what's happening with Russia's aggression, do you still feel as confident in your thesis that you wrote for The Better Angels of Our Nature? And secondly, can you help me to understand Bayesian statistics, which I suffer with not understanding?
The first one, well, certainly the invasion of Ukraine is a pushing against a 77-year-old tide, namely the abjuring of interstate war, particularly wars of conquest. And it is certainly anachronistic in that it breaks a lot of precedents, particularly in Europe and among developed countries that invading each other for raw conquest is something that became less and less likely. So it is absolutely a counterexample to that historical process. Whether it means that the process has ceased, is now going into reversal, of course we don't know. I suspect not. I mean, it could, but I suspect not, because Russia has clearly been punished by the very regime that has reduced the likelihood of war over the last 77 years, namely rejection and punishment by the community of nations in the form of sanctions and moral condemnation. It's also been punished on the battlefield since the Ukrainians themselves and their Western supporters have not acquiesced to this act of aggression. And in terms of history's verdict, it's pretty clear that Putin will not go down as a glorious conqueror, but as something of an evil fool. Now, that may not be enough to make this a one-off exception, but I think that that's not a bad bet either. In terms of Bayesian reasoning, which some people in the so-called rationality community consider to be the most important tool of reasoning that a rational person must command, it goes back to Hume, who was a contemporary of Bayes. And it basically that the core of the idea is that we can develop a kind of a calculus or a mathematics of belief rooted in evidence by the following conceptual leap. The conceptual leap is that belief in a hypothesis is not 1 or 0, but it can be anything in between. It can be conceptualized as a number between 0 and 1, a decimal fraction. And that's the first conceptual leap. The second conceptual leap is that if you think of which can be conceived not just as a number, but as a probability. That is, it is coherent to say, I think that the chances that a particular hypothesis is true is 0.72 or 0.37 or 0.06. Now, that's the conceptual leap. Once you do that, the second leap is to consider the degree of support of a hypothesis by evidence to be like a conditional probability. That is, what is the probability that it will rain given that the sky is dark? What is the probability that this putative cure of a disease is effective given that 60% of the patients got better? Once you make the leap of degree of evidential warrant as a conditional probability, then Bayes' theorem sounds scarier than it is, just falls out. And all it says is that the rational degree of credence in a hypothesis, how much you should believe it, depends on 3 numbers, that each one of which is intuitive. The first one is your priors, that is before you even look at the evidence. How plausible, likely was the hypothesis? Second is the likelihood, that is, if the hypothesis were true, what are the chances that you would obtain the evidence that you have obtained? And you multiply those together and you divide by the prevalence or the probability of the evidence across the board, namely whether the idea is true or false. How likely is it that you would get the evidence that you're now looking at? If, as in the case of, say, medical diagnosis, if some symptom is really common, like sniffles or back pain, then no particular diagnosis is going to be all that compelling just because it predicts that symptom, because so does every other or a long list of conditions. If a disease is common in the population, like the common cold, you give more credence that a given person has the disease than if it's an extremely rare disease. And if the disease commonly causes those symptoms, then if the patient has those symptoms, that also jacks up your credence. Mathematically, it ups the probability. So basically, Bayesian thinking is a way of translating the fuzzy intuitive belief of degree of warranted belief in a hypothesis, degree of credence, into the mathematics of probability. That's Bayesian reasoning. For more, I recommend the chapter called Beliefs and Evidence in my book, Rationality, which systematically leads the reader through Bayes' theorem. Again, the mathematics is barely high school algebra, but also shows its relevance to everyday reasoning, scientific reasoning, political forecasting, and all the other domains in which rationalists say you ought to apply Bayesian reasoning.
Thank you.
Do you know, I didn't think that could be done. I didn't think it was possible to explain Bayes' theorem in a nutshell like that. Well done. So you're right, human bays were contemporaneous, but I don't think they knew of each other's existence, did they?
Yeah, it's not clear that they did, although they may have been exposed via intermediaries. It was kind of in the air, and there is some speculation that that Hume knew of bays.
Mm.
Now, John, I'm as you can see from the background, I'm actually in my university office now, and I have a student at the door, and
Okay. Yes.
I can't put off my appointment with her, unfortunately.
Just one final remark. Enlightenment Now was very optimistic, and it was written before the Ukraine invasion. Do you think it needs another chapter?
Well, I don't characterize it as optimistic. I just characterize it as based in data that most people are unaware of that indicate that progress is a real phenomenon, a phenomenon that is hidden if your view of the world comes from headlines, visible if it comes from data, but it is not an attitude that we should only expect positive things to happen. It is a demonstration that positive things have happened, and an attempted explanation as to why they have happened, namely the application of reason, science, and humanism.
Yes.
If you have someone who doesn't apply, is not committed to the ideals of humanism, such as Putin, who quite floridly rejects the idea of universal humanism in favor of civilizational or national glory, then you won't have progress.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Tinker.
Thank you. Well, Anthony.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.